Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, very successfully we are running our series on history of English literature, and so far we have conducted 18 sessions under this series. We have tried to understand the various aspects under this series. Yesterday we discussed on Victorian poets. Today we would be discussing on Victorian prose. In the two sessions we would be talking on, in first, the makers of Victorian prose, whereas in the second half we would be discussing on the art for art's sake. And for this very discussion we have once again with us Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya is an eminent academician. Under his able guidance, lots of students have been awarded with their PhD degrees and have been associated with the various organizations. Dear friends, let's welcome our guest Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya, under whose able guidance we would be discussing on Victorian prose. Hello sir, welcome to the EDUCET lecture.
Thank you. Well, today in this lecture we will discuss the Victorian prose. While talking about the Victorian age in general and then about Victorian poetry, we try to identify its peculiar, qualities as literature, because every age produces its own literature which is generally different from the literature of the earlier times, particularly the one immediately preceding it. So, the one immediately preceding the Victorian age was the literature of the Romantic age. In the Romantic age, we saw that literature was largely personal, private, individual, relying upon his, her fancy and imagination, exploring the unknown territories of life as well as the mind. Now, in the Victorian age, we have the opposite emphasis. As against the personal, we have emphasis on the public. As against the individual, we have the social. So, the concerns now have become wider, because as it has been said earlier also, very important things of history have taken place meanwhile. One of them, industrialization. And owing to industrialization, there was rise of the middle class in a big way, because more and more industry, more and more people employed to work in the industry, and this workforce constituted the middle class in England. Now, this very large segment of the population, they wanted their own literature about their own lives, about the life they were interested in. So, obviously, new kind of prose and new kind of prose fiction that came about in the Victorian age. During the Romantic period, we saw how the writers were confined to their own private worlds and their own personal lives, their own dreams and aspirations. But now the writers look outside, not within. They are more involved and engaged with the problems of society, religious, political, social. So the major issues of the time, they constitute the subject of the Victorian prose, just as it did that of Victorian poetry. So the Victorian prose, like the poetry itself, has the main task of reconciling the opposites. It's not being swept into one direction as Romantic literature was, going away from the real and going into the exile, going into the unknown. Now there is return of the exile. The Victorian age can be said to be the return of the exile, the romantic exile, and return to society, back into society. Obviously, if you are back into society, you have to address the problems of that society and you have to use a different idiom altogether, idiom which is comprehensible to the general public. Now, when Wordsworth and Coleridge, they wrote lyrical ballads and formulated their philosophy of language, they invoked nature, natural man, and the pre-civilized purity of life and human nature. So obviously they were ignoring the culture and civilization, considering it as false, considering it artificial, considering it unnatural. But the Victorians think otherwise. They do not take it unnatural, nor against human nature or life. They take it as the common idiom of the people, and therefore the language that the Victorians used is closer to reality, closer to the language that people actually spoke at their workplaces. So that's why we have in the Victorian prose a language which is not weird, which is not otherworldly, which is not esoteric, which does not belong to the dream world or the nowhere place. Here and now. That is why literature of the Victorian age is known for its realism. And the literary movements of realism and naturalism came about during this very period. Just as the Romantic movement had come about in the early 19th century, 1798 to to 1837. Now, between 1837 and end of the century 1900, that is the period of the Victorian age. And during this age, as I said, the major force that had emerged, which transformed the lives of the people, lives of the entire lot in the society, was industrialization. And in thought, utilitarianism. And in literature, realism and naturalism. So, all these are related phenomena and they express each other. So, literature accordingly addressed itself to the realistic in life. So, we have not only a different language, different from what we had in the Romantic literature, we have now different concerns also. Concerns are public, not private. Concerns are social, not individual. Concerns are of general importance, not of individual fancy or imagination. So, literature of the Victorian age is not fanciful or imaginative in that sense. It is concrete, it is balanced. And the major practitioners of prose during this period were Thomas Carlyle, then John Ruskin, then Henry Newman. These were some of the leading writers of the age. And you know the subjects they wrote upon. Matthew Arnold wrote on culture and anarchy. He wrote on various subjects under the title Essays in Criticism. So, now criticism for the first time is becoming an essential component of literature, which was not there before. Because earlier there were ambitions, aspirations, dreams, new thought, explorations. That is what the Romantic poets or writers were doing. But now, no longer that, esoteric world. Now what we have is here and now. And in this here and now, you have these writers writing on the subject which immediately concern people. So, Matthew Arnold wrote Essays in Criticism. So, criticism is an essential part, is the operative part. The whole weight of the essays goes there. And he wrote on various subjects, including culture. For the first time, culture becomes the subject of literary writing, which was not there earlier. And his first prose book, famous prose book, Culture and Anarchy, besides the Essays in Criticism, two series, first in 1865 and the later and near the end of the century. So, those two series, besides that, culture and anarchy. So, in this culture and anarchy, the public issue, the social question being raised is that for any refinement, for any progress of any society or community, has to come through the evolutionary process of civilization and culture. Civilization relates to the general material progress of society, but culture relates to the moral and spiritual side of that evolution. Your science is progressing, your industry is progressing, but is your man in society improving, getting better in terms of moral values or spiritual outlook? Quite often it is the other way round. Your science and industry, they are going forward, they are progressing by leaps and bounds, but in the process the human factor, the human subject gets degenerated, deteriorated, degraded, losing its moral fiber, which gets weakened by the time. So, this happens. So, to ward off against that risk and danger inherent in the material progress, writers like Matthew Arnold, they took up this task of warning the society, putting the people on guard against the dangers inherent in the craze for material progress. Industrialization came about, yes, and it materially benefited individuals and nations. England became very powerful, so much so that it became an imperial force, ruling several other countries in different continents, Asia, Africa, America, these three big continents. It was ruling, tiny country, because of industrial power. But proportionately, did the humans become superior, refined, more cultured? Arnold says no. It's in fact the other way around. And he warns that unless a simultaneous evolution and progress takes place in the cultural evolution, civilizational progress of society, there will be anarchy. So, the choice is between culture and anarchy. Either you have culture or you are doomed to anarchy. So, this was a great book that Matthew Arnold wrote. Similarly, Thomas Carlyle, he too was a great mind, great writer. First of all, he wrote on the French Revolution, which by itself was the greatest event of the century, because for the first time here was a war fought for human dignity, individual freedom, and equality. Equality, fraternity, dignity. These were the three slogans of the French Revolution. And Thomas Carlyle wrote on that, reminding people why the war was fought, why the French Revolution came about. And he is reminding his countrymen not to forget that. The lesson is that by and by, liberty, equality, fraternity has to be ensured to every individual. Only then the country as a whole can be said to be progressing or evolving for the better. So Thomas Carlyle wrote on French Revolution. He also wrote on of heroes, hero worship, and the heroic in history. So you can see the change. Wordsworth and Coleridge are writing about themselves. Shelley and Byron, Keats, again writing about themselves. But here, history is the subject, and the heroes of history, and what is heroic in the historical events. These things become the concern of literary writers during the Victorian age. So they have come out of their personal, subjective worlds, and they are now totally committed to the society as a whole, the nation as a whole, the people as a whole, and not to their subjective, narrow, personal, private interests. Similarly, Matthew Arnold, I have already talked about, Essays in Criticism, Culture and Anarchy, also wrote Literature and Dogma. Again, issuing warning against narrow thinking, a dogma. And when you reduce religion to dogma, Arnold says, then you kill the very religious spirit for which religion was created. Because the spirit is killed, and you are just observing the outer form, just like carrying body without soul. So you are just a lump of matter. You are a material presence, having nothing moral or spiritual in it. So Thomas Carlyle, just like Matthew Arnold, wrote on French Revolution, on Chartism. Chartism again was a movement during the industrial period, industrial boom, warning against crash materialism and retaining the moral and spiritual values of life. Similarly, Cardinal Newman, another prose writer of the Victorian age, he wrote an important book which was the first book on the subject, and the book was The Idea of a University, 1859. The idea of a university. For the first time, we had colleges, we had universities, but no one really knew the difference. No one really knew what the university is all about, what are its goals and purposes. So Newman laid down and defined the role for the university. And he said, university by its very definition is universal. universal in more ways than one. In the first place, it is open to all, without any discrimination, because it is a meeting of the minds. It is a workplace for the intellectual work. Secondly, its universality lies in its being open to all disciplines, bringing together all aspects of knowledge. You have humanities, you have sciences, you have applied sciences, you have commerce and management, you have engineering, so on and so forth. So, all these departments of knowledge, they are brought together on one campus called the university. And Newman says they are brought together not merely for coexistence, not merely having just a plot of land for itself. No, they are brought together there for an active interaction with each other. So, unless there is knowledge sharing, unless there is a give and take of the individual departments' findings, researches, there is no use. So, this is a holistic idea of knowledge. That knowledge is all one. It has to be put together. It cannot exist in separate compartments. And therefore, all its departments must come together, share their knowledge, and with common goals and purposes, the university must evolve itself into something better and better, more and more comprehensive. Thank you. Well, there is a long list of Victorian prose writers, but we are trying to confine to the major ones. Here in this context, we have, besides Newman, John Ruskin. John Ruskin wrote one famous book called Unto This Last. And see how these writers are making use of traditional institutions like religion for social purposes. So, Unto This Last is from one of the Bible stories, Old Testament. The point is that somebody has employed people for work, and those people come at different times. They start arriving at 9 o'clock, some of them come at 9:30, some of them came at 10:30, so on and so forth. And the last came when the work was about to finish, say 5 o'clock in the afternoon. When it came to making payments to them, so the owner made equal payment to all. Then he was asked, how come? This fellow came at the end when the work was complete and you are paying him the same wages. There he says, I will treat all equally. Hence, my payment will go even unto the last. So Ruskin picks up the phrase from there, unto the last. By the way, it was this book which highly influenced Gandhiji. So much so that he translated it into Gujarati and then Hindi. The Hindi translation of Unto This Last is Sarvodaya, Sabka Bhala. So, that is what Ruskin wrote, famous book, Unto This Last. And it was highly influential. So, in a way, in the Victorian thought, all these prose writers reflect one way or another a tinge of the socialist leanings. They are not self-centered. They are not, dipped into the personal world, private world. They look outside. They have public concerns and they feel about it. They write about it. So that's why John Ruskin's book, Unto the Last. And similarly, we had several other, like John Stuart Mill, wrote on liberty. This again is an important subject of the time. And writing on liberty, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron, Keats, they were also champions of liberty. But then, speaking in a language and through an idiom and through a world which was highly personalized. So obviously its impact was not publicly visible. It was confined to their own lives. But here you find, like Mill's essay on liberty, it's of public importance and public interest. And he is emphasizing the liberty for everybody. It's not for any particular class of people, privileged ones. It is for everybody, including the underdogs, lower, middle or higher, whichever segment of society, all have a right to liberty, not just one. So John Stuart Mill, look at all of these writers, beginning with Thomas Carlyle, Matthew Arnold, Cardinal Newman, John Ruskin, all of them socially, publicly, politically involved in the affairs of their times. But as we go down in the century, in the later years, closing years of the 19th century, we find that a change comes about. Because every movement begins with great enthusiasm. But obviously, after some time, it will start losing steam. You cannot keep up the same pace. You cannot keep up the same force in the movement. Gradually, it will lose force and it will get weakened and weakened and make place for something else, something new. That is the law of life. Change is the law of life. And as I said and keep saying, action and reaction. It's the chain of that which constitutes life, which constitutes history, history of civilization and culture anywhere. So here also, when you reach the closing years of the 19th century and near the end of the Victorian age, because now new forces were coming in, and we shall see how with the new century, 20th century, new movement in literature came. We called it modernism, which again was a reaction against Victorianism, just as Victorianism was a reaction against Romanticism. So from the romantic flight into wilderness, flight into the unknown, Victorian age was a sort of landing, coming down and coming down to here and now, the problems before you, not somewhere in the unknown, exploring the wild, exploring the dark regions of your mind and life. No. So, by the time you reach the end of the century, you find the Victorian spirit now, the socially, politically, publicly oriented spirit was getting weakened. And the new movement that was emerging, it came to be called art for art's sake. Obviously, it's a reaction against art for society's sake. because Ruskin, Carlyle, Matthew Arnold, these writers of the first generation of the Victorians, they were using literature for promoting their social ideas or public ideas or political issues. So, it was a means towards an end. Literature was a means. Now, the reaction against it came, why use literature as a means? Why not literature for its own sake? But then, as somebody, I think it was Oscar Wilde, raised a question, what is that sake, by the way? For its own sake? What is that sake? If you delink it with society, if you remove it from society, then what is this sake? What are you writing for? But then this movement did come about, and the main figure in this movement, art for art's sake, was Walter Pater. Walter Pater wrote his famous book, The Renaissance. So, he wanted to go back to the past, to the medieval art and to the Renaissance. So, he thought the later centuries, 17th, 18th, 19th, where you see material progress, where industrialization developed, utilitarian thought dominated, and people were more and more absorbed in the material life, physical life. So, Pater thought to rejuvenate arts, to give new life to literature, it must go back to the Renaissance and the medieval times. So, he revived the medieval poetry, medieval arts and the Renaissance poetry, and wrote about it. What were the strong points of the Renaissance? What was strong in the medieval art? So, he wrote on all that, Walter Pater. A famous book, The Renaissance, 1873. Another, he wrote Imaginary Portraits, 1887. Another writer of the time was Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was a different kind of writer than Pater and others. And he wrote the famous novel, The Importance of Being Earnest. The Importance of Being Earnest. This was 1895, end of the century, more or less. And here he shows a different line of thought altogether. So, now we are sliding back into the medieval, back into the Renaissance, and sliding away from the socio-political focus of the early Victorians. So, the later Victorians like Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, and then R.L. Stevenson, They are taking us elsewhere. Stevenson, we know, wrote that famous book, Travels with a Donkey. So, another sort of going back to nature. But then, not exotic. He is not invoking a world which is not known. He is invoking everyday world. If you read that book, Travels with a Donkey, it's very moving. And the stories that he gives from his own personal experience, they are of the poor people, destitute, who do not have homes to go to and will sleep in the open even in extreme winter or extreme summer. The reason behind his Travels with a Donkey is that he had tuberculosis, TB, and those days, there being no other medicinal treatment, he was advised to sleep in the open, to stay in the open. So he thought of this, purchased a donkey, had his bag and baggage, bed, everything, books there, and he will travel the whole day. And wherever the evening fell, he will go to sleep. So during those years of his traveling with a donkey, he met all kinds of people, beggars also, women without homes, without any help. And he narrates how he spent time with such people, men and women, belonging nowhere. So nowhere men and women. So it's a great book, Travels with a Donkey. He also wrote, if you remember, Treasure Island. Treasure Island, where again the picture is horrifying. In this treasure island, you have a group of youngsters, public school boys and girls, now caught up on the sea and getting no help, just floating on. There comes a stage when they are short of eatables, nothing to eat because they have exhausted everything. So what do you do now? So they started killing each other, eating each other. So he is showing what humans are like. It is all a matter of life situation. If you are pushed a little too hard into a difficult environment, then you are capable of doing anything. Then all your culture and civilization come to nothing, and you are back to your pre-civilized life. And you are the same brute we used to call the pre-civilized man, the brutes. So he shows in Treasure Island how essentially, basically, deep down, at bottom, we have the same brutes in us. It is a matter of how and where it comes out. You create those difficult conditions and it comes out. So long as you are having an easy life with everything available to you, all goes fine. Things remain covered up. But the lid is removed, taken away. The moment you have difficult situation, and then the reality comes out, then your real inner self is shown, that you are no different. You still continue to be a brute. So all this is shown by R.L. Stevenson. But then, as I said, the influence was not merely from industry as a phenomenon, as a material reality. There were minds, there were people engaged in this process. Besides Arnold, there were, as I mentioned, several more. And even scientists, not merely social scientists, not merely literateurs, but also regular scientists like Charles Darwin, like T.H. Huxley, like Harvey. This bunch of scientists in the later 19th century, the Victorian age, they were equally concerned about where we are going, about the future of civilization, about the future of mankind. And they devoted their entire lives to researching into this question. Look at it. Sacrificed all their luxuries and comforts, all their personal, interests, and devoted themselves to an idea, to a research. And Darwin experimented for years after years on little animals, including mouse, cat, hare, dog, this, that, and then the bigger animals. And through these experiments, he came to the conclusion that man is no special creation of God, whatever the Bible might say. Bible you will accept by faith, or any book of religion for that matter. There it's a question of faith. You don't question anything. You don't ask any question. You don't look down into it, inside it. Just accept whatever is said there. That is why every religious book says things in the name of God. It is the word of God, and therefore you can't challenge it. But Darwin said, no, man has evolved himself from the lower animals. There was a stage when man was monkey. That was the last one. Before that, other cruder animals without mind. So, from monkey to man, that is a stage of evolution. And this development in the mind of man gave him all the powers. So, that is how the Victorian prose became very, very different from the romantic, exotic, private, unknown world of romantic literature. So, language, thought, concerns, all were practical during the Victorian age. Thank you very much.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. Today, once again, we had a very, very vivacious session. I believe that all the students who might have watched us or would be watching us with the help of YouTube would be benefiting from it. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all the lectures concerning to history of English literature are there for you on YouTube. You can access those lectures, and afterwards, if you feel that you have any query or if you want to give your feedback, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. This lecture is also going to be there on YouTube for you very soon. So, with this note, we'll have to take your leave now, because we would be meeting again tomorrow, and tomorrow we would be discussing on Victorian criticism.
Yes.
And what else are we going to study under Victorian criticism tomorrow, sir?
Well, criticism will include the prose fiction as well as the short prose, essay and novel, because they are a part of the prose. And criticism, as Matthew Arnold had defined, even poetry as criticism of life. So it may be poetry, it may be prose, it may be long fiction, prose, novel. So essay, novel, poetry, all we say are working towards the same goal. So tomorrow we will look into the critical writing of the age, because in criticism they look into what literature is doing. So you have both kind, theoretical criticism, theoretical writing, as well as practical writing. In practical, you give interpretation of individual texts, individual writers, Tennyson as a poet or Arnold as a poet. Theoretical, you formulate what is poetry, what is literature, etc., etc.
That means we are going to get maximum of the knowledge from Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya once again tomorrow. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.